Just as a reminder, you can visit us at thoughtsexpanded.com. That's thoughtsexpanded.com to sign up for our amazing Patreon exclusives, listen directly, and share our latest episodes with your family and friends. Thanks for listening. Hello, and welcome to this new episode of Thoughts Expanded. I'm your host, Wiggy, and today we have with us Jeff.
Hello.
And Rab.
Hey there.
I am talking like my favorite television show host, Robin Leach. If you know nothing about Robin Leach used to be the man in charge of Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, which was a TV show that lasted, I think, maybe one season, and went all over the world and looked at people's richest mansions, castles. It wasn't really just mansions at that point. It was just rich people's castles, which means they were all over Europe. So we're gonna talk about something a little wild today.
Castles.
And let's talk. There's definitely castles. But we're gonna talk a little bit about the Anunnaki, which most people consider myth. Some people consider legend. Some people consider the beginning of a lot of different things. This is a wild story. If you have not heard this before, this is wild. So get ready for the wild.
Going to be
Sure to
a
take your-
version of this story.
It is also going to be
Even wilder than normal, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be wild. There's only so much that I actually know. And as we've discussed before, I don't do that much research. It's based off of hearsay and whatever general information I pull together very quickly. So the story of the Anunnaki originates from ancient Mesopotamia, particularly in Sumer and Babylonia. And it's been talked about, reinterpreted by tons of different people over the years. The most popular interpretation is that one that was done by Zecharia Sitchin. He claimed the Anunnaki were essentially extraterrestrial beings who visited Earth from a different planet, which is called Nibiru, and has an orbit that is very elongated and only reaches any kind of proximity to Earth once every 3,600 years, which is why it's currently not in our orbit, in our solar system.
Why we can't see it.
That's why we can't see it.
So
because
when
it
was
takes
this
so
guy,
long.
making up this theory, or developing it one way or the other?
Zecharia Sitchin was in the 70s.
Okay.
So this is right after all the drugs, right? This is right after all the drugs. But the main idea behind this is there was this father god called Anu. Well, I'm gonna go back a little further. So essentially, these beings were having some problems with their planet, And the problems they were having with this planet was that their atmosphere was deteriorating. And the only scientific plan that they could come up with saving their atmosphere was by finding gold, which was extremely rare on their planet. And so they went out to other planets to find gold. It was in more abundance here than in every other planet around us. Other than Mars, I guess there was some mention of there being some gold on Mars at some point. They didn't call it Mars, they called it something else, but it's been assumed that they were talking about Mars, I should say.
So you're saying a sub theory of this is that like they stripped mine Mars entirely already?
Could possibly be. If I wanted to take this to heart, right, and I want to be like, yeah, this is definitely something that happened. One of the things that we do know for a fact that's really strange about Mars is that it looks based on, I can't remember exactly what the compound's called, but there's a compound that's like heavily found on Mars that is generally only found during nuclear explosions. So if I was going to take this to heart, I would think that there was some type of nuclear war on Mars, which just destroyed everything.
Well, I mean, or you could be used technical nuclear detonation to strip mine too. I mean, the same way that we use TNT.
Very true. Very true. Or they were using it for power and they just blew that shit up when they left.
Sure.
It could also be, there's lots of explanations there. But the idea was that they needed gold in order to save their planet. And they had a lot of it here. So they came here. I don't know exactly how many there supposedly were in the very beginning of this. I know that there was at least 3, according to tales. There was Anu, who was the father. He was also referred to as the father god. And his 2 sons, Enki and what was his name? It was Enki.
Theodore.
Enki and Enlil.
Okay.
Yeah, well,
Enlil was given the task by Father God to kind of be in charge. He was actually the younger brother, but he was given the task of just kind of being in charge of everything.
What were the other 2 there for then?
The Father God doesn't actually do anything in any of the stories. There's just origin there.
I see.
Enki was given the responsibility of cultivating a worker force for them. And what I mean by that was they came to Earth, they found that the planet had the gold they were looking for. And so, but what they were also able to find was some version of monkey or Neanderthal or previous version of human.
Right.
And they, in Enki, genetically modified those humans so that they could be those creatures, to turn them into humans so that they could be used as a labor force to mine gold. I said this is wild. This is wild. So essentially there's a accelerated what's it called?
Evolution
of people from monkey or previous state to the current iteration that we currently live in. That we are.
right?
So this gives it back to a lot of which is something that we've talked about before. There's lots of different types of origination stories in religions and what have you. This is the one that dominated ancient Sumer and Babylonia. And this is their origin story for people.
So you're saying in ancient Sumer, they believed that they came from another planet? People, or that they were ruled over by gods that came from another planet?
Essentially, yeah. So like everything, and like we do now too, and have done when we talk about the Bible sometimes, we're also like, okay, is this just a collection of stories? Does
Sure.
it have any truth or merit to it? Whatever the case may have you. There's no way for us to know what they actually believe, didn't believe. Most scholars tend to think that this story is nothing other than fiction. However, if we go out another 10,000 years and people start, or 5,000 years, and people start looking back on our current religions from today, they could say the exact same thing. They couldn't say,
Sure.
like, oh yeah, for sure they definitely believe in that, or they don't. Like, they go, oh well, there's the Bible, there's the Quran, there's the Torah, right? Like, they go, these are all different versions of the same story, right? So it's to say, like, yeah, they believe that. I can't tell you whether or not they actually believe that or not, but that's the idea. Like, these stories were written on clay tablets that eventually became stone. Like, the method that they had a completely different language, which is considered a dead language. That nobody knows what it sounds like if they were to speak it or whatever. Essentially what they would do is they would take this soft clay and they would wait for it to start hardening. And while it was hardening, they would get to a really good point where it could be used to kind of like mold and chip away at, so where you could write down letters onto the clay tablet, and then it would eventually solidify and just turn into stone. So that's what these things are written on. And one of the arguments is that this had to have been something that was important to them. And the argument as to why that is because back then your entire day was, how do I get food? They had, like, yeah, there was Sumer, and yeah, there was Babylonia, but there wasn't really a sense where we have today where food is just abundant, and like they were working all the time just to survive. And so why would they take time out of their day to write this stuff down in clay tablets that had to take time to, like, had to be perfect if it wasn't something that was important to them? I guess the flip side of that is maybe there's the one guy who just didn't want to do any fucking work. He just wanted
Sure.
He had a story in his head he really wanted to tell, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's like, this is one of the first religions at all. What they believe. I mean, at least that we have in recorded history, right? I mean, very possible people had religion before that, but chose not to write it down, or didn't have the technology to write it down. But I mean, effectively, like, that transition of writing down your religion came alongside, like, the transition from hunter-gatherer society to like a sedentary, at least in terms of movement, society that did agricultural, right? That
Mhm.
grew crops. And I mean, I think that they kind of made religion almost like as an excuse to have people whose job it was to just figure out like how were those crops going to be directed? Like, how could you direct surplus at all, right? I think the priests were really the first ones to like collect taxes, because they had to survive. Obviously, they weren't growing their own food, and they were the ones whose responsibility it was to figure out how to turn that extra crop into wealth. At least the first iteration of that.
Yeah, I mean, you see some of that to a very small degree with in more modern day Buddhism. And I'm talking about actual Buddhism with Buddhist temples, right? Like they collect alms and then they spend their time. I mean, they do like they plant their own gardens and all that other kinds of stuff
Sure.
for self sufficiency, but they also like collect alms to help pay for stuff, and then they spend most of their time pondering enlightenment, right? Like that's part of the, and then they share that information, so yeah, so there's still, I mean, whether or not you want a religion, right? But yeah, so the idea of accelerated human growth is a big theme here, and is hotly debated as to whether or not the stories from these tablets and from the Epic of Gilgamesh, which also comes out of the same era, is part of the original stories that some other religions are based on. There's a lot of crossover between some of the stories and some other stories. There was one of the so one of the Dead Sea Scrolls was actually found to be a couple hundred years older than the rest of the other sea scrolls, and predates the Bible by close to 600 years, something like that. And the collection off of those particular scrolls seems to be a crossover in between what the Sumerians thought as and what the current book of Genesis looks like.
Sure.
So there's speculation there that this is the beginning of at least some of the faiths that we have today, and is the true origin story. I mean, who knows? Right, that's that we're talking about it because it's interesting, not because we know, right?
Right.
So a lot of other things happened here. So there was the two sons. The younger son that was in control of pretty much everything. He kind of hated humans. He thought humans were loud and annoying, and just didn't like humans at all. So he cast them out of what was essentially Eden, because he's the one who created this magical place. And Enki felt bad for them being their creator, and originally the humans could not procreate; they could not create more of themselves. And Enki felt bad for them, so he gave them the ability to procreate and taught them how to use metal, which was essentially how, I mean, as far as we consider, that's really how we broke out into the ability to to live the way we do today. Was our
Sure.
just metallurgy in general was gigantic for our species.
All right, I've played Civilization. Okay, I know how important metal is.
Yeah. It's super.
That's a
It's
whole
super
new
important.
era, baby.
Yeah, it's a whole era. So this was even before more modern times when we think of, how we learned how to use metal, right, and forge equipment and all of these things. This is way before then. And there have been findings of earlier metalworks before we thought we had the ability to do that. If I remember correctly, it was in the Nordic regions is where they originally found some metallurgy that had been done way before other places. So to the more the fun stuff. So Sitchin's theory claims that the giant flood, so the biblical flood, which has also been talked about in tons of other religions around the world. Almost every religion has a flood story where the world flooded and began anew from this crazy disaster.
Sure.
The Sitchin thinks that the flood story was a result of the Anunnaki attempting to control or reset humanity after their goals were already fulfilled from mining all the gold, or they were just no longer necessary. So, like we kind of talked about at the very beginning, how Mars was also kind of a part of this, and what happens when you don't need anything anymore, or whatever the case was. They just created a giant flood to wash away all the humans, and could be the origin story of the biblical flood.
I think it is fairly believed that that the biblical flood, like the fact that so many cultures have a giant flood event, that they're actually not related, and it just is the case that floods are not that they're common necessarily, but they're common enough that every culture could experience different ones, right? If you just date when people thought the floods were happening, it doesn't really line up. But obviously, we're here to kind of lend credulousness to this theory. I feel like jumping in and saying what is the counterfactual, I think is worth it, just in the sense of understanding, that this isn't just we're not presenting this as science either way, but
right.
I think it's worth saying what is the opposite? What do people believe actually happened? What explains the strangeness other than that? You know what I mean?
Well,
what
yeah.
What people actually believe is that these are just fantasy story myths, and somebody put together a story. And
there were huge floods for sure. That it has happened and continues to happen, right? There was a huge flood in Pakistan just a few years ago, or maybe even 2 years ago, I think. And if it wasn't for the fact that now we have a really good record keeping of the internet, there's nothing saying that 100 years from now that couldn't have been a great flood story that some grandpa told to, the last person who actually remembered living through it told to his grandchildren. And then now suddenly it becomes a story about God trying to wipe out all of humanity, because that's what it seemed like when that kind of thing happened.
Right.
Yeah. Very well.
I feel like it's a lack of consistent storytelling as far as the Anunnaki Nibiru thing, to not just say, oh, Nibiru was passing by, and they were hopping back onto their planet, and that, gravitational pull of the Nibiru coming by caused a great flood.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, if there was a giant planet that actually came that close to Earth, it would certainly disrupt our climate.
It would cause a giant flood. Yeah, for
Right.
sure.
Yeah, there's also speculation. I don't know where the origin of this particular thing comes from, but I've heard it multiple times. And that's that there was a another planet in our solar system that collided with Earth at a very specific time in the past. And that's what a portion of that is what our moon's made out of.
Right. That's the Planet X theory, right?
Yeah, the Planet X theory, and I've heard that planet be called Nibiru.
Don't tell NASA.
In other stories.
NASA
Yeah, don't show NASA this episode at all. Actually,
NASA does not like it when you call Planet X Nibiru. They really want to make a distinction between those two things. So.
Yeah. So what I'm going to dub, here's some of the things that I'm going to dub the quote unquote, and I'm putting quotes around this, factual bullet points, okay, that support this theory.
Yeah, I mean, to talk about this at all, we kind of have to treat it as a fact. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense. But I mean, the fact that we're mentioning it doesn't mean that we necessarily believe it, right? I mean, I think that's worth saying.
Yeah.
So let's get the support.
So the first one is the ancient Sumerian texts themselves.
Sure.
Okay. So the Anunnaki are mentioned in Sumerian texts such as the Enuma Elish and the Babylon, which is the Babylonian creation myth, and the Epic of Gilgamesh. These texts describe them as powerful beings that played a role in the creation of humans and civilization. So these ancient texts exist way longer before other documents, texts, tablets exist. The tablets themselves depict the Anunnaki as divine beings, often seen interacting with humans. So some of these tablets are actually, is it cuneiform when they're pictures?
That's hieroglyphics,
where they're essentially pictures.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of different methods of writing, like ancient methods of writing or pictures. I think cuneiform was Sumerians' method of writing, but I think they had sort of a letter system of some kind.
Yeah, well, they definitely had that, but they also had these like this like artwork, right? That they did.
Okay, yeah, they use a hieroglyphic language. I was wrong about that.
Yeah. So there were these depictions of these giant. By the way, they were considered giants. And there were images of these giants interacting with humans, and humans are seen as like tiny little creatures, even kind of imp-like at the time. There's one famous picture, monkey-like, yeah. And there's one really famous picture where there's this giant Anunnaki sitting on a throne, and he's got this little monkey human sitting on his lap. And the little monkey human has this like long tail. So imagine like just tiny humans with tails. Essentially, it's got a human face, except it's got a tail. So kind of like maybe this is the origin of Dragon Ball Z mythology too.
Well, what'd be really funny is if if we have it all wrong and the giants were actually the humans and they just had like tiny little monkeys back then. Everybody just had a pet tiny little monkey. It was a totally normal thing.
Yeah, everybody just had a chimp. It was just perfectly okay. The next thing is Sumerians' knowledge that they had of astronomy. So you can look this up. Not perfect. but kind of close enough to make you think about it. They had surprisingly advanced knowledge of astronomy. They had awareness of the planets in the planets' orbits at a time when that just seems ridiculous. Some theories around this suggest that the knowledge may have been passed down from the Anunnaki, that this was information given them from beings who came from the stars. That's how they knew it. That's how they knew they were able to pass that on. They had really mysterious, like, technological advancements. The Sumerians, Egyptians, other ancient civilizations, it's becoming less and less doubtful that they didn't have advanced technologies at a specific time. Precision stone cutting, complex mathematics. The pyramids, for example, are one such case of both of those. And there's the theory that this information came from the Anunnaki. It was, once again, was passed down from them. Because they would have had to have been very mathematically inclined in order to travel the stars.
Sure.
Because we know it's just so complex. The ziggurats that were built by the Sumerians were said to be the dwelling places of the gods. So you talked about famous castles at the beginning, right? There's definitely some castles here, some god castles. And they were also, some theories suggest that they're essentially either landing platforms or communication centers for the Anunnaki, either where their ships could come down and land, take off from, those kind of things. On that note, there's a lot of theory surrounding the Bible about, and some other religions around. We've talked about this before, about UFOs. There's a lot of hinting that maybe angels weren't really angels because they're described in a way that would make you think that maybe it was a UFO instead, right? Things of that nature. The Great Flood, which we talked about, which is commonality story. And similar deities across ancient cultures. So deities with similar characteristics to the Anunnaki appear in other ancient cultures. The Egyptian gods, the Greek titans, sometimes is cited as evidence that they were the first. And the genetic manipulation claims by Sitchin, right? So there's a point in time where we kind of call it like the lost knowledge, or whatever it is that we want to call it, where it's evident that humans leapfrogged the system, where we went from not being able to do anything to doing all of these things all at once, right?
Sure.
Evolution as a theory even has a problem with this. Like Darwin, when you go back and read the evolutionist theory, Darwin says over and over again, like, I know this is going to sound crazy, before he says the thing that he says. And one of those times was because he can't explain the jump in whether or not it's a purposeful consciousness, whether or not it's the expansion of our brains, whether or not it's the development of language, whatever it may be. There's a spot there where something very special happened, and we don't know how or when it happened.
Well, to go back to what I was saying earlier, I mean, this is the advent of taxes and the ability to extract from people some kind of profit that can be put towards various things. And I mean, that fundamental like advance can explain a lot of this, right? Like suddenly now a priest can decide, okay, look, we see that you're using this kind of tool. We're going to pay somebody whose job it is to just make those tools, right? And now that person can spend their life trying to figure out like how to make those tools better, and make huge advances for everybody else, because they're now not worried about how they're going to feed themselves, And
right.
so
Rab's not sold. Rab's not sold on this one.
Well, I mean, I think no matter what, I would guess that probably none of us are sold entirely on any of this.
Yeah,
I think it's probably worth just saying what the other explanation for it could be, for everything too, like that if like it's not, to me, it's not completely out of the question that if aliens exist, that humans have had contact with them in the past, rather than just the future, right? Or just the present, right? I mean, it seems logical that given that humans have been around for like hundreds of thousands of years, especially like previous human species, that contact with aliens could have happened then as well as now, right? I mean, now it's just a blip compared to all of history. So it doesn't seem completely out of the question to me. But also, like, it's, a possible explanation for technology exploding is the fact that suddenly they have agriculture, they have people whose job it is to just direct funds, and that advancement causes other huge advancements.
And so I'm going to throw some more at you. Okay, but we're going to go based off what you said. So one of the things was you started talking about taxes and things like that, right? So we're talking about currency. We're talking about where that comes from. Humans' fascination with gold. Gold is pretty fucking useless. But because it's rare to a degree, is valuable, right? Ancient civilizations would use gold not only because it looked pretty, and so they would use it to create statues. They would use it on their construction. They would use it to adorn themselves, to make themselves look better or more important or wealthy or whatever you would say. But our fascination with gold, and that potentially having somewhere that it came from. Also, there's been a find. There's ancient gold mining sites in Africa that were uncovered not that long ago, where we found that there were mining sites specifically for gold kind of before there was a lot of other mining. And it was very evident that it was specifically for gold. One of the other
time
things,
travelers, though. That's all that is.
yeah, time travel.
These people go back in time and tapping into some old gold days.
That's how Trump does all of his buildings in gold and makes his gold toilets and shit.
Not going to give him that level of authority.
No, it's not him. Like him himself.
Going back in time.
Yeah, some contractors that Ethan didn't pay.
I mean, he doesn't
right?
pay.
It's It sounds like some right-wing fever dream fan fiction about Trump going back in time to secure the gold he needs to fix America.
Yeah.
We're gonna make this country great again. We're gonna make Mansa Musa pay for it.
Yeah. One of the other things is and there's some problems with this one too, but the Sumerian kings list. I don't know how much you know about this one, Rab.
No.
So the Sumerian
Sounds like
kings,
Craigslist.
yeah. The Sumerian kings list.
Kingslist.com.
Kingslist.com. So the Sumerian kings were known to live for thousands of years. We also know that there's a big problem with calendars the farther back we go. So that's where the negative comes in here. Is that we've also been told that Moses lived to be like 1,000 something years old, right? Like there's a lot of problems when we start talking about old calendars. However, they were told to have lived for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. Another part of...
I've got to jump in real quick. Not Moses. Pre-Moses. Pre-flood.
Yeah, it was
Pre-flood
Enoch, right?
Well,
You're right. You're right.
It is who you're really thinking.
No, was it Noah? Am I thinking of? Noah.
Enoch is
yeah.
a lot too.
Yeah, Methuselah is like...
Yeah,
Noah's specifically who I was thinking of when I said Moses was Noah. Noah was like 1,000 something years old.
Yeah, and I mean, one explanation for that, like you said, the calendar system. I mean, literally, the Jewish calendar, even to this day, is based off of cycles of the moon. And so, like, if you just divide the numbers given in the Bible by like 12, things start to actually make sense in terms of human lifespans, right? And so, if they just counted each passing of the moon as one period, and they didn't have any other ways to define a whole year, then it seems pretty logical that people would live for like 1,000 years. That's like 90 years, right, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. So the King's List, and one of the other parts of the story is that eventually they started mixing in god genes with the humans to create these hybrid creatures. These hybrid creatures also had the ability to live very, very long. And the assumption is that those characters in the Bible who did live to be thousands of years old are part of this genealogy. And so yes. Yeah, that's part of the story there as well.
And there's also, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there were some books found talking about like the Nephilim, and
yes,
which is often tied into the Anunnaki thing as well by people who are following along with that story, So the idea that the Nephilim were the offspring of human people and Anunnakis breeding together. And those were like the giants that we think of,
So when you start to think of, people even correlate that into, what's the story? David and Goliath, right?
Right.
That there was still some people from that lineage that were still around during that time. The mathematics, which I talked about, which is still used in timekeeping and astronomy today. So this is highly advanced things that started a very, very, very long time ago.
One interesting thing is that they had a base 60 number system. So in instead of base 10 like we have today, they had base 60. Which is really interesting, just because it's like pretty useful to be able to divide up your, because you can divide it 60 into a lot of different things. Like one, it divides evenly 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, among others, right? So that base 60 number system, allowed them to do advanced mathematics and We also, I think probably to this day, like I think it carries with us how we count minutes and hours, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yep. There were a lot of artifacts that we can't really figure out, such as the Baghdad Battery. I've heard of this term once and only once in my life, and I don't know a lot about it, other than it's believed by some to be an ancient electrical device.
I think it's just jars filled with some kind of caustic material that produces an electric charge, right? If I remember correctly. Like, and who knows what they were used for?
Yeah.
So it might just be a coincidence that it had electricity. Maybe they were using it as like a magic trick where it shot off sparks or something. You never know.
Yeah, it could be. And the Paris map, which is the map that shows Antarctica before it was covered in ice.
Huh.
Has been cited as potential evidence. The alignment of ancient structures. So some of the things that we've talked about is some of the same things you're going to hear in explanations given to you by people like Graham Hancock, who start talking about similarities in different cultures and how they come together. The alignment of the Great Pyramid, True North. And during the time in which the Sphinx was created, they believe that the head of the Sphinx was pointing towards the constellation Leo. Just to name a couple.
What does that have to do with the Anunnaki, though?
Well, they're saying that these things were created were not created by more recent Egyptians. That these things were created well before these other people existed. That they were leftovers from another time, much older time.
So I think, and maybe I'm jumping the gun here, but I feel like this gets to the root of my beef with the Anunnaki theory, is that it just feels like it's trying to take every advancement that ever happened and make it because of this one thing. Like, it feels like it's trying to rob humanity of its agency in like what we've done and what we've been able to accomplish, and try to turn everything magical when not everything needs to be magical. Like, it feels like a super conspiracy theory in that sense. And like,
it's definitely a super theory.
Yeah, like
one way or the other. Whether
it's too much.
Yeah, I mean, another thing about it is just that, like, I think it has origins in, like, when British people were rediscovering basically, like, what ancient cultures had done. Like, a lot of archaeology started in those times. And I think effectively what happened is that, like, they refused to believe that ancient civilizations, especially in places other than Europe, were able to produce certain things, right? And so they needed an explanation. And the fact that they had help, like, was a big way. Like, even like the theory of Atlantis partially comes from this, in the sense that it's like, it was kind of believed that there was this ancient civilization of specifically white people who went around and helped other cultures, and then disappeared under the sea. And so that, that explanation, not that this stuff is necessarily like racist inherently. It's just like, it comes from a racist ideology to some degree.
Right. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. The only thing that was, because we're talking about the pyramids, the pyramids specifically, is what drives me nuts about the pyramids is I also don't think there's any way in hell that a, a modern Egypt, and not even modern in a sense of like today's Egypt, but like even what you would consider ancient Egypt, according to like what records they have and what records they don't have, and knowledge that's been handed down from the peoples and all of this other kinds of stuff, is that there's no explanation for how perfect the pyramids are. Like mathematically trying to create this stuff. Like, so say if we say, and this is most of archaeology, most of Egyptian archaeology tries to say that this stuff was created over 1,000-year period where hand tools were used to create these things. The reason why I don't think that's really possible is because if we go back and we even look at just the obelisks, okay, like the obelisks of ancient Egypt, they're cut out of solid blocks of rock. These aren't like pieces of rock that are stacked on top of each other like you see elsewhere in the world. Like these are solid blocks of rock that are cut in perfect squares with perfect triangles to them, and they're just mathematically advanced, and they weigh so much. They're so heavy, and so you have to cut one of those out of a solid piece of rock, make it perfect, and then move it to wherever it is you want to put it. And they didn't have, as far as we can tell, they did not have the technology to do that. I'm not saying that this stuff was coming from Anunnaki, but what I'm saying is I think it does lend credence to civilizations that were older than what we think the old civilizations are, especially pre-Ice Age, where maybe we did develop for 100,000 years even before we thought we did. And maybe that's that missing link we were talking about before. Maybe they figured all this shit out before then, and we got left some of the cool shit, right?
We recorded another episode recently where we were talking about the destruction of the Library of Babylon, and how that was a huge impact on like the advancement of humanity as a whole. And like I don't have a problem believing that there might have been another civilization, very much kind of an Atlantean kind of idea, although maybe not quite so white, of like there being an advanced civilization somewhere out there that, you know, was wiped out for one reason or another. You know, I can understand that. I can believe that. But I just feel like, especially with like great achievements in humanity, like the pyramid, that it just feels like, I don't know, a lack of faith in mankind.
Well, the problem is it's not a lack of faith. It's a lack of evidence of how. Like, that's really what we're looking for.
Like, the Great Pyramid took probably 20 years to build. And, like, we have, like, what we assume to be a pretty good idea of how it was probably done.
Well, and ultimately, like, the precision aspect is really just by counting, right? I mean, if they made all of the bricks the same size, and they, like, even though they don't have a helicopter to go over and make sure, okay, look, it's exactly this size, it's exactly this angle, whatever, right? They know that each of the bricks is a certain size, and then they can count the number of bricks as they go up, right? And I mean, that's like, that technology is pretty obvious, right?
Right.
Their transportation, I mean, like, they would roll them on giant logs, basically. And I mean, they had invented like levers and pulleys and stuff. So I mean, that was how they got them up on the logs in the first place.
Well, there's some interesting stuff out there that I'll recommend everybody go just to take a look at. But there's lots of information out there about kind of debunking these methods as being the way that they would have been able to do it, just because of the heaviness of the stones and the specific accuracy. Like the Great Pyramid is off of true north by something like 0.01%.
Sure.
Right, but that's
Like-
a single block placement to get that started. You know, like you're talking about how like perfect and precise it was, but like it's not like each stone is literally perfectly cut, and you know, because there is variation.
Well, they would have to be because of how an angle works itself up like on a slant. Like they would have to be perfect.
Yeah, but they could make
To
the
get to that
measurement
point.
of the angle one time and then use it to cut each brick, basically, right? Like they decide how much of a slope
Yeah.
it is compared to the
Yeah.
ground. They have a
Yeah.
perfectly flat surface for the ground, and then they have basically an angular measurement. Like it could be made out of wood, and they just cut the stone along that angle.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that they were able to cut stones so precisely without it messing up all the time. I mean, you also don't know how much it messed up, right? I mean, they could have thrown away thousands of those bricks because they weren't cut to specification. I think one thing that's important to say is that I think the pyramids were effectively like a public works program for Egypt. Like they had a lot of people because the Nile was bountiful, and they did not have there was only one harvest season a year. And so effectively the pharaohs did not want people just partying the whole time and thinking of ways to revolt or whatever. So they would put people to work during the non-harvest seasons, and they would pay them in food because it wasn't the harvest season, so food wasn't as plentiful, right? But they obviously had huge stores of food. The pharaohs did, right? So they would effectively put people to work doing something, and so the reason that they chose to build something so massive is so they couldn't just be like, okay, we're done. Now we get to party for the rest of the year. You know, they had to keep working on this one project. And as long as, you know, I mean, a pyramid could be built over maybe potentially a small one could be built over one pharaoh's life cycle and become his tomb, you know, so that it was effectively like a way to keep people busy. And Egypt was famously extremely bountiful. And so they didn't need to spend their whole year worrying about where their food was going to come from.
Mm-hmm. I'm not gonna keep pushing the point.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm also not trying to make it sound like
yeah.
Yeah.
But I am going to say on this point that the big problem that I see. So that's the first problem that I see. Whether or not whatever happened, right? That's the first problem that I see. It's a problem. The second problem is the historical account from the Jewish people. I mean, it's famous in the Old Testament that the Jewish people were slaves in Egypt and were used for their labor to help create pyramids.
Well, that isn't necessarily true. Like, nowhere in the Bible does it mention pyramids, just that they were slaves and having to do stuff. I feel like that's a pretty modern take on the myth that they were doing the pyramids, and it's often just for storytelling purposes.
Well, yeah, maybe that may be the case, but that's the part that would really kind of break that open for me, was if there was some type of account that was more recent than this type of stuff, right? Like,
I mean,
like something.
that happened though. You know,
I mean, but like I'm saying with like, if that is the Jewish account, that kind of that they were slaves and actually helped build the pyramids, at least to some degree, we would actually have some type of historical proof that there was a way that they did it, and we just don't know what that is now, right? Like that would make more sense to me. But not knowing if that's actually the fact or not is really what gives me this doubt that it was done with hand tools and pulleys and carts and all this other kinds of shit, when that shit was so fucking heavy and the stuff was done so fucking precise that it just seems a bit too much for what they were capable of doing at that time to me. But let's move on there. That's essentially, so we spent a lot of time like trying to essentially back up the story, but the big thing is there's lots of origination stories. This is one of them. There seems to be lots of correlation from other origin stories to this origin story, and this origin story is older. We often talk about how Christianity in particular took on a lot of things from other religions. Like it's very accurate to say that the Christmas tradition, the solstices,
right,
Easter, like, you know, like there's lots of examples of religions taking on aspects of older religions that came before them, whether or not that was to help pacify and transition people into the new religion, whether or not that was just something that happens naturally over time, just because there's multiple things in one area, so they all kind of get jumbled together. And then whatever is the dominant one just takes the title, right?
Sure.
Like, who knows? But because this is the oldest record of something resembling a religion, and it has so many consistencies and similarities to other current day religions, it's not a large leap to say that a lot of those stories are based on this more original story.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, that to me seems a lot like, not trying to even say that this is necessarily fake, but like, it seems to me a lot more plausible that people base stories off of each other than that, you know, that somebody else built the pyramids. Like, I don't see how those two things are necessarily related, right?
Yeah, that's fair.
And
I mean,
sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, like, to me personally, I do find the idea that like we came from outer space, or that like some aspect of humanity was based in another planet, or that, you know, things that didn't just like start here randomly. Like, I find that appealing. I mean, I find this type of story appealing in the sense that like it doesn't require there to be a god who just like randomly decided to put humans into one corner of the universe that's like particularly focused on them, you know. Like the fact that this type of theory basically says that like, okay, yes, something did make us, but then it left, and now we're kind of on our own. Like, I find that potentially appealing. I think that there's obviously like, I think there's real explanations for what the Egyptians and other cultures were doing a long time ago that don't rely on this being true. But I also like, I do definitely see the appeal for sure.
Yeah. I think it's like important to note that like the idea of the Anunnaki didn't pop up until like the 1970s. You know, all
Yeah,
this
that's
stuff.
when he wrote this book.
Right. Exactly. What I'm saying is that prior to the 1970s, this was just the religion of ancient Sumer.
Right.
You know, like he just co-opted their stuff to make a whole new thing. You know, so it's interesting to talk about, you know, from that standpoint, but really what you're just trying to get to is that this ancient Sumerian religion, the first, like really the first religion, has stories that other religions copied from. You know, doesn't really have so much to do with the Anunnaki as much as it does just ancient religion was plagiarized by future religions. You know.
Yeah. And multiple things can be true at once, and none of it can be true. So who knows? I mean,
Right.
that's the life we live in.
But within this realm of what we're talking about, it's undeniably true, in my opinion, that other religions, Abrahamic religions in particular, ripped off the Sumerian religions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And others.
Yeah.
And
Others ripped off Sumerian, and Abrahamic ripped off others. Both ways, it's others.
Yeah.
And like, if I remember correctly, I mean, Rab, you can probably tell me if I'm wrong or not, but the Indian, the Hindu gods were before Roman gods, right? From a pantheonic.
I'm not sure about that. I really don't know one way or
Principle.
the other, to be honest with you.
Um,
I mean, at the very least, the modern Hindu myth is that they certainly are, because they are like the cycle of maybe I'm just talking on my ass, but they specifically mention a cycle that lasts like 4,100 years or something like that. So I mean that would imply that they're quite old. But I mean that doesn't necessarily mean that they were. Like they might have been created mid-cycle by somebody.
might have been a calendar thing too.
Yeah, that's
Who knows? Who knows? But yeah, that's just kind of us bringing this more into the zeitgeist and filling your minds up with crazy talk, as we like to do. So, yeah,
I will say though, the thing that really killed the Nibiru Planet X thing for me, because I remember first hearing about that in like 2009 and being like, oh yeah, this is really interesting. There's going to be this planet maybe passing by. And because 2012 was the prediction.
right.
Like it was like a Mayan calendar prediction that in 2012 Nibiru would be passing back by Earth. But then that just passed by. Nothing happened. And they just keep tacking on new dates for when it's going to happen, you know?
That's the problem with these types of predictions, is that it never happens. And then all of them just go, oh, well, maybe we calculated that wrong. And they just keep like rehashing the same shit over and over again.
It's because we lost all the good math in the Babylonian fire.
Should have done base 60. That might have helped our calculation.
Should have done basis. Also, I have more origination theories coming up, so keep that in back of your minds, people. Okay. There's gonna be more origins coming from me.
More origin stories from Wiggles.
Yes.
Okay.
1,000%. All right. Well,
like
thanks everybody.
Thoughts expansion.
Yeah, the original thought expansion. Thanks everybody for joining us today. We really appreciate you. Don't forget to sign up for our Patreon. There is even the free that'll gives you notifications on new episodes and everything like that. We really appreciate you guys, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.